Fox News Alert. I'm Bret Baier in Washington on this 4th of July. It is a ballistic missile, not holiday fireworks, that has the attention of Americans and others around the world. North Korea says it has successfully tested its first intercontinental ballistic missile. U.S. officials now concede that the North Koreans may have changed the entire dynamic with this launch. While the U.S. intelligence community is not sure how far the communist North is in its effort to miniaturize a nuclear weapon to put on a missile, they now say the missile test fired last night might have been able to reach Alaska. And reports from the region suggest it was launched from a mobile launcher, providing yet another challenge for the U.S. Correspondent Kevin Cork has the breaking details and reaction tonight from the White House. Good evening.
Bret, happy Independence Day to you. And you're right, a dramatic day here at the White House. Senior Trump administration officials said to be considering their options in dealing with North Korea in response to that provocation. This is very interesting, in particular when you consider the administration has long talked about what it might do should North Korea finally be able to oil. And of course, now they're looking for a true response to the latest missile provocation from Pyongyang. It was a historic first for the rogue regime. For a little more than a half an hour, an intercontinental ballistic missile fired from North Korea blasted across the Asian sky before coming down in the Sea of Japan. A 568-mile-long journey that could go much farther in shaping future U.S. policy in the region. That launch, tracked by NORAD and U.S. Pacific Command, took to the sky at approximately 2:40 p.m. Hawaii time, July 3rd, and initially was deemed not to pose a threat to North America. But further analysis suggests that with a possible range of some 4,000 miles, a similar launch could potentially strike Alaska. Also, for the first time, the North used a mobile launcher, making it much more difficult for the U.S. to track and disrupt future tests.
This is probably the toughest national security issue we face today. Negotiation is always an option, but I've seen no signs that they're willing to come to the table. I mean, just look at what they did to Otto Warmbier. I mean, this is a regime that is not acting in a way that would lead to diplomacy.
Reaction from the commander-in-chief initially coming by way of Twitter, with the president writing, "North Korea has just launched another missile. Does this guy have anything better to do with his life?" Hard to believe that South Korea and Japan will put up with this much longer. Perhaps China will put a heavy move on North Korea and end this nonsense once and for all. The tweets, just the latest iteration of the president's threadbare tolerance of Kim Jong-un's dangerous chicanery, which poses not only a severe threat to U.S. interests abroad, but now, apparently, even here on the homeland.
The era of strategic patience with the North Korean regime has failed. Many years, and it's failed. And frankly, that patience is over.
Despite a robust emphasis, the president's reliance on China to quell the North's nuclear ambition has produced precious little.
I do like President Xi. I wish we would have a little more help with respect to North Korea from China, but that doesn't seem to be working out.
But that hasn't stopped Beijing and even Moscow from working to de-escalate tensions between Washington and Pyongyang. Their respective foreign ministries issued a joint statement today saying that Russia and China will work in close coordination to advance a solution to the complex problem of the Korean Peninsula in every possible way. This, as a majority of Americans surveyed in our latest Fox News poll believe President Trump hasn't been tough enough on North Korea. 56% in that survey right there. By the way, this also into Fox News, Bret. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley has requested an emergency meeting at the UN to discuss the ongoing situation with North Korea. Sources telling us tonight that that meeting will likely take place sometime Wednesday afternoon. Bret?
Kevin Cork live on the North Lawn. Kevin, thank you. The Trump White House is just the latest in a long line of administrations that has tried to deal with North Korea. Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen tells us how we got here.
Korea, hope spread with the armistice.
The armistice that ended the Korean War brought an uneasy truce to the peninsula, but established an implacable enemy to the United States in North Korea, a Stalinist dictatorship ruled ever since by the corrupt and brutal Kim dynasty. President Clinton launched negotiations that climaxed in 1994's agreed framework, under which the North agreed to freeze its plutonium program in exchange for fuel and economic aid and the construction of 2 light water reactors.
This agreement is good for the United States, good for our allies,
In time, however, U.S. intelligence would discover that Pakistani nuclear scientist A.Q. Khan was running a nuclear bazaar for rogue states. The Bush-Cheney administration confronted North Korea about its covert nuclear work, and the regime admitted it. The Undersecretary of State for Arms Control at the time was John Bolton.
And when the negotiators of the agreed framework were confronted on this reality and the absurdity of giving North Korea light water reactors, their argument was they had believed that the North Korean regime would collapse before they got to nuclear weapons.
In the six-party talks that followed, with Russia and China participating, then they had secured the dismantlement of North Korea's entire nuclear apparatus, again in exchange for aid.
We're going to get out of the business of producing nuclear weapons.
The demolition of a cooling tower at the nuclear complex in Yongbyon seemed like a good faith measure, but a declaration intended to show the North's compliance instead contained traces of the enriched uranium the North denied it had, and its nuclear program accelerated, with the first nuclear device detonated in 2006, followed by 4 more over the Obama era.
The threat is much more immediate now. And so it's clear that we can't repeat the same approach, failed approach of the past.
Rather than pressing our strategy to the point of some kind of miscalculation on the part of the North Koreans or others, for that matter, the important thing would be to keep the pressure on the Chinese to try to see if we can't get North Korea to the negotiating table.
But President Trump has effectively written off the Chinese as a useful intermediary with the North Koreans, our de facto policy for the last decade or so. With the commander-in-chief tweeting last month, it has not worked out. At least I know China tried. Bret.
James, thank you. More analysis in just a moment about the North Korean situation. Meantime, President Trump leaves tomorrow for the G20 summit in Hamburg, Germany, where he will meet on the sidelines with his counterparts from China and Russia. Correspondent Kristen Fisher has a preview tonight from Warsaw, Poland.
President Trump lands in the Polish capital Wednesday, where he'll find an audience that's open to his brand of politics.
Poland is a country with a government that's like-minded with Trump. They have a conservative government that's also favored very restrictive immigration policies.
But it's also an Eastern European country that exists in the shadow of Russian aggression and has been concerned that the Trump administration isn't fully committed to helping NATO fight it.
If NATO countries made their full and complete contributions, then NATO would be even stronger than it is today.
In May, the president admonished NATO allies that don't spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Poland barely meets that minimum, one of only 5 nations that do. The alliance has pledged an additional $12 billion this year after President Trump challenged them.
Right now, there are at least 1,000 U.S. troops here in Poland, a fourth of the total number dedicated to NATO's Operation Atlantic Resolve. That's the show of force that really ramped up back in 2014 after Russian-backed forces invaded Ukraine. There's also a U.S.-backed missile defense system that's set to line here sometime next year. But the Polish government is still going to want President Trump to take a very hard line when he meets face-to-face for the very first time with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit on Friday.
He has to choose whether he's going to prioritize the NATO alliance, prioritize transatlantic security and standing with improved relations with Russia.
The president may look to improve relations with European allies too, specifically German Chancellor Angela Merkel.
The times in which we can fully count on others are somewhat over.
The president and Merkel clashed during their last meetings over trade deficits and the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord. Administration officials have signaled the president is open to renegotiating the climate agreement or starting work on a new one. But it will be the meeting with Putin amid allegations Russia influenced the 2016 U.S. election that will put the president's diplomacy to the test.
To the extent that it looks like Trump is too eager to smooth things over with Putin and just cooperate with Russia despite Russian bad behavior, he'll be subject to domestic criticism here at home.
And once again balancing his brand of politics with criticism abroad. In Warsaw, Kristen Fisher, Fox News.
While North Korea remains the most pressing and urgent foreign policy issue facing the U.S. and the Trump administration, the Middle East is far from calm. Qatar remains defiant in the face of Arab neighbors who have imposed political and economic sanctions on that country for its support of terrorism and extremism. Correspondent John Huddy has the latest on this standoff from our Middle East newsroom.
The clock is ticking, and Qatar still hasn't accepted a list of demands from 4 major Arab countries accusing the energy-rich nation of supporting terrorism. But today, Qatar announced it is producing more liquefied natural gas, 30% more over the coming years. Perhaps a message that Qatar is preparing for more energy independence if the fight with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt continues. Asked if that can mean shutting off the natural gas valves to the UAE, a major importer, the head of Qatar's state-owned petroleum said,
"This is a decision which would not only be made by Qatar Petroleum, but also for the government. And of course, it depends on the situation in the country."
The Gulf states and Egypt cut diplomatic and transport ties with Qatar June 5th, accusing it of supporting Islamic militant organizations in Egypt, Syria, and Libya, and providing asylum to their leaders. On June 22nd, the countries gave Qatar 10 days to comply with the demands, including closing a Turkish army base, shutting down Al Jazeera, and cutting back on ties with Iran. The deadline was extended 48 hours early Monday. If an agreement isn't reached, the Gulf states and Egypt could impose financial sanctions on or force Qatar out of the Gulf Cooperation Council, seen as a counterbalance to Iran. Qatar's foreign minister delivered a handwritten letter today to Kuwait's Sheikh Sabah al-Sabah, who is mediating the crisis. It's unclear what it said. But if today's announcement is any indication, it may not necessarily have been good. Qatar's petroleum company president said the 1 million barrel per day increase of natural gas will come from the country's massive underwater North Field in the Persian Gulf, a field shared with Iran. And Qatar's foreign minister said earlier today that his country has shown, quote, goodwill and good initiative for a constructive solution, though he didn't elaborate on that. Well, the foreign ministers of Bahrain, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE will meet in Cairo Wednesday to discuss the next step in the ongoing dispute. Bret.
John Huddy in our Middle East newsroom. John, thank you. In other foreign headlines, U.S.-backed forces in Syria have breached the wall around Raqqa's old city. Senior Pentagon officials tell us it's a major advance in the weeks-old battle to drive ISIS militants from their self-declared capital. Iraq, meantime, that country's forces with U.S. backing are continuing their steady advance against the last the remaining is Venezuela. Venezuela's Supreme Court has taken another step in undermining the country's chief prosecutor. The panel has named a prosecutor once sanctioned by the U.S. to be the nation's #2 law enforcement official. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's government has already stripped Congress of its powers there, and massive demonstrations against the Maduro government continue weekly. A lot to cover across the world. Let's talk more about the president's foreign policy challenges. The most pressing of them, of course, North Korea tonight. Elliot Abrams is Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington. And Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, also here in Washington. Gentlemen, if you stand by, we just moments ago received a statement by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, and in part it reads on the North Korean situation. The United States strongly condemns North Korea's launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile. Testing an ICBM represents a new escalation of the threat to the United States, our allies and partners, the region, and the world. Global action is required to stop a global threat. Any country that hosts North Korean guest workers, provides any economic or military benefits, or fails to fully implement UN Security Council resolutions is aiding and abetting a dangerous regime. All nations should publicly demonstrate to North Korea that there are consequences to their pursuit of nuclear weapons. We intend to bring North Korea's provocative action before the UN Security Council and enact stronger measures to hold the DPRK accountable. The United States seeks only the peaceful denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the end of threatening actions by North Korea. As we, along with others, have made clear, we will never accept a nuclear-armed North Korea. The President and his national security team are continuing to assess the situation in close coordination with our allies and partners. Again, a statement just moments ago, as I was introducing you all, from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. Michael, your thoughts on that?
Hi, Bret. Well, my first thought is that this sounds like an intensification of the economic pressure. If one listens to Mr. Tillerson's comments, he began by reminding other countries they have obligations about North Korean workers who may be on their territory, presumably about the kind of business they do with North Korea. What that suggests to me is that Secretary Tillerson is aware that there really probably are no good military options for the United States. We could try to shoot down missiles before they're launched, but that risks escalation, and it may not even be possible to do it very well if it's a mobile missile launcher, as you reported 15 or 20 minutes ago, and we don't know where the missile's launched from. So it just is a reminder, the economic instruments, however unsuccessful they've been so far, may still be our best recourse if the whole world gets behind it.
In conjunction, Elliot, with that statement, at the same time, we're getting news from South Korea that the U.S., along with South Korea, holding joint ballistic missile drills in response to North Korea's ICBM test. Again, that's South Korean media reporting coming out at exactly the same time as that statement.
Well, we're going to find out one thing interesting if there is that UN Security Council session that Nikki Haley. Where are the Russians and the Chinese? Are they going to be willing to have additional sanctions on North Korea? Or do they just want more talk and do we have to do this alone? I think, you know, flying over North Korea is a good thing to do, but the question really is, are we going to get serious about financial and economic sanctions? We were for a while, about 10 years ago in the Bush administration, and then we let up on them. What I mean is, for example, if you're a bank and you're doing business with North Korea, you're out. No more business with the U.S. That's significant sanctions. That would affect China, Chinese banks. Are we going to do that? That's the kind of tough measure that we should be willing to take.
Do you think that's what you hear in that statement from Rex Tillerson?
Unclear. Tough talk, but are we willing to really go forward with it? Because it's going to interfere with U.S.-Chinese commercial and financial relationships. So that's the question we're going to find out in a day or two. Are we really willing to do any of this?
Yeah. To your point about the mobile launch, if in fact that's true, experts in the region say that's what they see in the photographs. It adds another dynamic to the challenge, not only with the ICBM that can reach Alaska, a two-stage missile, but also the fact that they could move them around and we wouldn't be able to stop them before they launched.
That's right. With the North Korean missile threat so far, at least whatever medium to longer range threat there's been, frankly, some of those missiles might not have made it anyway, but we would have seen them being prepared for launch for an hour, 2 hours, being fueled. Liquid fuel rockets on a launch pad, you can see the preparation, which means you can preempt in the classic sense of the word, if you choose to do so. And we would have had that option at least in war, even if not in peacetime. Secretary Carter, Secretary Perry, two recent Democratic secretaries of defense, wrote an op-ed in 2006 saying we should consider that even in peacetime. And so you have those kind of options with a fixed launch site. You don't have that option nearly as easily with a mobile missile. You may be able to try to shoot it down in the ascent phase, but you may not see it as it's being prepared for launch.
Elliot, President Trump is getting ready to go to the G20. The sidelines there, he's going to have the first official bilat with President Putin, the first official bilat actually since 2015 between the U.S. and Russia. It comes as Putin meets with Chinese President Xi tonight, talking in part about North Korea. Here's a soundbite from earlier.
As a part of mutual bilateral priorities, Peninsula problems with a goal to guarantee a stable peace and stability in Northeast Asia. We agreed to actively develop our mutual initiative based on Russia's step-by-step plan for Korean settlement and Chinese ideas, at the same time freezing the nuclear capabilities of DPRK and large-scale military exercises by the United States and Republic of Korea.
So again, he says no more exercises. The U.S. obviously is doing something tonight with South Korea.
Well, this is an important meeting. You know, the first Kennedy-Khrushchev meeting, Khrushchev decided Kennedy was basically a wimp, and that led to a crisis in relations. The critical thing here is that we say no to Putin on that, because they've been trying for decades to get us to stop doing military exercises with South Korea. They want us out of there. So if we agree to that, it's a terrible beginning of the relationship between Putin and Trump. I hope he rejects it.
Quickly, this has changed the dynamic. I mean, this is a different level we're at right now.
Right.
True?
Yes, I think so. And by the way, I agree with Elliot. However, if we could get a freeze on nuclear production that we could verify, or that the Chinese and Russians and some other third parties could verify, I would consider a freeze for a freeze. But the one that's being offered now is not at all favorable to American interests.
Right. And quickly, Elliot, on this other topic that is not getting a lot of coverage is this battle between Qatar and these other Gulf states about what's going to happen and for Qatar possibly supporting extremism and terrorism.
The Qataris need to come at least halfway. They need to stop doing what they're doing. If this results in the end of the Gulf Cooperation Council, it's just a gift to Iran, and we should really be working hard to avoid that. It would help, by the way, if we had a State Department full of diplomats. And one of the problems here is Secretary Tillerson's a kind of one-man band. We've got no Assistant Secretary for Asia, got no Assistant Secretary for the Near East. Makes it hard to do all this diplomacy.
Okay. Elliot, Michael, fortuitous 4th of July to have you in. Happy Independence Day. Thank you very much.
You too, Bret.
Up next, the tragic story of a terribly ill British child and how President Trump and the Pope are trying to help. President Trump and Pope Francis are both attempting to help a British child suffering from a rare and deadly illness. The story is now in the international spotlight, and with that, all of the international politics around it. Correspondent Benjamin Hall has the story tonight from London.
11-month-old Charlie Gard was born with an extremely rare genetic disease, mitochondrial depletion syndrome. His brain is damaged and he is currently on life support. Now, doctors and lawyers, against the wishes of his parents, who want to spend as much time with him as possible, have said it's time to switch it off and let him die.
The reality is that Charlie can't see, he can't hear, he can't move, he can't cry, he can't swallow.
His parents fought all the way to the European Court of Human Rights after British courts ruled against them.
Permission to appeal must be refused.
Last week, his parents, who have raised $1.7 million towards Charlie's case, lost another bid, this time to take him to the US for experimental therapy, after judges ruled that continued treatment would cause significant harm to Charlie. Their lawyer responded.
Connie and Chris are facing every parent's worst nightmare. They're struggling to understand why the court has not at least given Charlie the chance of treatment in America. The medical evidence is complex and the treatment offered potentially groundbreaking.
Now President Trump has also weighed in after members of his administration spoke to the parents. Yesterday he tweeted this: "If we can help little Charlie Gard, as per our friends in the UK and the Pope, we would be delighted to do so." The Vatican also intervened, with Pope Francis praying the hospital allows Charlie's parents to accompany and treat their child until the end. The case has reminded many of Terri Schiavo, the right to die legal case in Florida, which pitted family against courts. Today her brother released a statement saying Charlie Gard's life is more valuable than British and European bureaucrats realize. This is a tragic ethical and legal issue which pits on one side medical institutions and courts against Charlie Gard's parents and their wishes on another. And it's also a topic which divides whole nations. Bret?
Benjamin Hall in London. Benjamin, thank you. More on this with the panel. Millions of Americans are spending this 4th of July away from home. One of the reasons? Cheap gasoline prices, which brings us to gasoline taxes, or the possibility of them. The federal rate has not been changed in decades. Some state governments are already making moves on their own. Correspondent Ellison Barber shows us tonight.
A big chunk of travelers this holiday weekend are driving out of town. According to AAA, there are 2.9% more drivers than last 4th of July. Experts say that's partly because gas across the country is cheaper, roughly 4 cents cheaper than a year ago. But how long will that last? In a May interview with Bloomberg News, President Trump said he would consider increasing the federal gas tax. The White House seemed to backtrack shortly after.
There was no endorsement of it or support for it. He was just relaying what another industry group had shared with him about how to pay for the roads and bridges that need to be repaired.
On average, the American Petroleum Institute says Americans pay a little more than 49 cents in state and federal taxes on every gallon of gas. For diesel, it's 55 cents per gallon.
Well, the gas tax essentially finances the Highway Trust Fund. It's the most significant source of funding for building and improving federal highways with some help from the states.
The last time gas is 1993. It hasn't been adjusted for inflation, and the Congressional Budget Office says by 2021, the Highway Trust Fund will not have enough money to fulfill its obligations. Republicans like Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and Wyoming Senator John Barrasso say they're against increasing the federal gas tax. Democrats like Senator Chris Murphy are for it. In a New York Times op-ed this week, Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel called on President Trump to increase it by 10 cents. But it's not a cut and dry partisan issue. South Carolina Congressman Tom Rice, a Republican, also supported a significant increase in the federal gas tax and introduced legislation to do it in 2015.
Congress doesn't want to raise it because it's very unpopular with motorists, deservedly so, because so much of the gas tax is squandered on non-highway needs.
States have their own gas taxes as well. As of July 1st, 10 states have increased their gas tax, some by as much as 10 cents. Bret?
Elson Barber, live here in D.C. Elson, thanks. Tonight on this 4th of July, some stories now about America's heroes. First, a man who risked his life to save others, and the effort to get him recognition many believe is long overdue. Here's Lucas Tomlinson at the Pentagon.
That's where I was at.
Stratton is one of just 5 USS Arizona survivors from the Pearl Harbor attack still living.
We got hit with a big bomb and then exploded like 1,000,000 pounds of ammunition. The fireball went about 60, 70 feet in the air, and the explosion could have taken us away, but it didn't, and thank God we made it across.
Trapped aboard a sinking battleship, Stratton and 5 other sailors managed to escape the horror, which killed more than 1,000 of his shipmates, with the help of a fellow sailor who threw them a lifeline from his ship moored next to Arizona. With burns over 60% of his body, Stratton had to escape the burning warship.
And we proceeded to go hand over across the line. That's 60, 70 feet, and that was the tough part. And he kept saying, "Come on, sailor, you can make it."
The man who rescued Stratton and his fellow sailors that day? Joe George. In his book, All the Gallant Men, Stratton described George as, quote, perhaps the strongest man in the harbor, an all-Navy boxer. George disobeyed his captain's order and threw Stratton the line that would save his life. Stratton's granddaughter, Nikki, says she owes her life in addition to her grandfather's because of that young sailor's heroic actions that day.
We have 4 generations here because of that man. We have 14 people in our family who wouldn't necessarily be here without Joe George.
In fact, Stratton didn't know the name of the man who saved his life until years later, when his family asked the Navy to investigate his rescue and dig up interviews from sailors who were at Pearl Harbor. That's when they discovered their hero's name, Joe George. More than 75 years later, Stratton wants him finally recognized for his valor.
But here he was, he saved 6 people's lives, and he didn't get anything. Somebody in Washington should have the guts and the honor to take care of that.
Stratton feels so strongly that Joe George deserves a medal that he and another USS Arizona survivor are coming to Washington later this month to press lawmakers and the Defense Secretary to act. They hope that President Trump will intervene. Bret?
Lucas, thank you. North Korea pushes President Trump's buttons again, and now an official U.S. response. We'll get reaction to all of it from the panel when we come back.
And Chinese ideas, at the same time freezing the nuclear capabilities of DPRK and large-scale military exercises by the United States and Republic of Korea.
The era of strategic patience with the North Korean regime has failed. Many years, and it's failed. And frankly, that patience is over. The United States calls on other regional powers and all responsible nations to join us in implementing sanctions and demanding that the North Korean regime choose a better path and do it quickly, and a different future for its long-suffering people.
That was President Trump Friday, but this was something that happened last night, a firing of an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, by the North Koreans. Just within this hour, the Secretary of State has released a statement saying, in part, global action is required to stop a global threat. Any country that hosts North Korean guest workers, provides any economic or military benefits, or fails to fully implement UN Security Council resolutions is aiding and abetting a dangerous regime. All nations should publicly demonstrate to North Korea that there are consequences to their pursuit of nuclear weapons, and we intend to bring North Korea's provocative action before the UN Security Council and enact stronger measures to hold the DPRK accountable. As you take a look at where this ICBM traveled, it was a splashdown about 480 miles away, but it's believed that this missile, a two-stage missile, could reach Alaska. And that is the big question about whether North Korea has been able